Welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm Kathleen Walter. With us now from Toronto is Lord Conrad Black, a member of the British House of Lords. Lord Black controlled Hollinger International, which published hundreds of newspapers around the globe, including the Daily Telegraph, the Chicago Sun-Times, and the Jerusalem Post. Lord Black is the author of 6 books. His newest is called Flight of the Eagle, the grand strategies that brought America from colonial independence to world leadership. And Lord Black, welcome back to Newsmax TV.
Thanks very much, Kathy. Glad to be here.
Flight of the Eagle chronicles American strategic history from our pre-revolution days to becoming the unrivaled supreme power in the world in just 235 years. While many attribute U.S. superpower status to good luck, geography, demographics, you credit several grand strategies instead. Can you share with us some of the key strategies that led to the U.S. becoming a superpower?
Yes, of course it is also true that it would not have become such a great power did it not have a vast, rich continent to occupy and was not able to attract large numbers of immigrants to raise the population very quickly in 100 years from 3 million to 90 million. Mm-hmm. But, and then on, of course, now to over 300 million. But to answer your question, it would have been very difficult to win independence in the first place if Benjamin Franklin had not helped persuade the British to expel the French from Canada, and then helped, in fact, almost single-handedly persuade the French to join the Americans in the Revolutionary War against the British. This was an astounding achievement, given that France was an empire. It wasn't a democracy. It was an absolute monarchy, not a constitutional one, as Britain was, the monarchy against whom the Americans were in revolt. And yet the French plunged into this war on behalf of republicanism and democracy and secessionism and paid a heavy price for it and got nothing out of it. And Franklin managed that. Abraham Lincoln masterfully handled the whole task of tying the underlying cause of the problem of the Civil War, slavery, into the ostensible cause, the attempt by the South to conduct a secessionist insurgency. Franklin D. Roosevelt did a brilliant job, a very cunning and almost imperceptible but brilliant job of tying the American national interest and public opinion in the United States to the survival of the democracies against the Nazis and the Japanese imperialists, and then assisting in creating the state of affairs in which the Germans and the Russians took most of the casualties, but the British and the Americans gained most of the strategic assets at the end of the Second World War. These were all tremendous achievements that wouldn't necessarily happen just because the United States was a rich, well-populated country.
Lord Black, the financial crisis and the subsequent recession have changed perceptions that the United States is still an economic superpower. Critics say that we're a debtor nation beholden to China, and when it comes to foreign affairs, they claim we are nothing more than a spectator in the Middle East. In your view, is the U.S. still a superpower, or are we a nation in decline, as some say?
Both. Certainly a superpower and a greater military power than all other countries in the world combined. But in decline from where you were in relative terms, absolutely. But that's not irreversible. And it is not about to lead to it being surpassed as the world's most important country by China or anyone else. I mean, China has been a very impressive story of an underdeveloped country bootstrapping itself up. But it still has 600 million people living as they did 3,000 years ago. It still has a largely command economy. It still has political institutions that don't work and have never been tested and rely essentially on the army. And with their understandable desire to prevent an unlimited explosion of population, their one child per family policy is going to give them a very aged population soon.
We've learned that President Obama is planning a drastic reduction of the United States nuclear arsenal soon. It's been reported that he's prepared to do so without Congress's approval. What impact do you see this having on the United States superpower status?
Encouraging completely irresponsible, ambitious, or at least aspirant nuclear powers such as Iran. I'm afraid it will not have the desired effect. I do not question for an instant the president's good intentions, but it will be just as conspicuous and in some ways more dangerous a failure than the plan of the late Defense Secretary McNamara and the presidents whom he served, John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, to allow the Soviet Union to gain nuclear parity with the United States. The assumption was that the Russians would then negotiate more constructively, and instead they just attempted to achieve nuclear superiority. Fortunately, they were frustrated first by President Nixon with his nuclear sufficiency doctrine, putting up to 10 warheads on each missile, and then by President Reagan with his Strategic Defense Initiative, a defensive system that negated or could threaten to negate much of the Russian defense effort. But unilateral disarmament has never worked. Preemptive concessions in a world such as the one we live in, inhabited by some of the irresponsible countries that are in the world, is exactly the wrong thing to do.
Looking at the world today with the past that you write about in the book, who are America's major adversaries? Russia, China, or the Islamic movements?
Well, I wouldn't use the word adversaries so much as rivals. There were, in a way, Germany could be a rival, but it would be a very friendly rival. It's an ally, it's a reliable ally. And it appears that when things shake out in Europe, the hard currency, well-financed, relatively coherent center of Europe will be a bloc voluntarily built around Germany, not an association of states such as Germany has led at times in the past through the application of force. These are people who would work voluntarily and happily with Germany. Most of the Baltic countries, Austria, Netherlands, Poland, the Czechs. A solid bloc of nearly 200 million people. The Chinese are emerging as a rival. I wouldn't call them an enemy particularly. They're neither a friend nor an enemy, but they're a rival. There's no real place for the interests of the U.S. and China, the vital interests, conflict with each other very much. But the Americans would wish to make sure that their allies in the area, the Japanese and Philippines and South Koreans and others, are not overborne or intimidated by the Chinese. So there's room for some friction, but not worse than that. Militant Islam isn't really a national force. It's a kind of movement, and it does seem more or less to be in control of some countries and have large interests in some other Islamic countries. But and it is, I suppose, an enemy, but it isn't really a rival. It's a nuisance, and it's a terrible nuisance. I don't make light of it. They commit these atrocities, and they kill a lot of people, but they aren't a threat to the existence of the U.S. or of our whole civilization the way Nazi Germany was.
The United States has long had a close relationship with Israel. That has changed during the Obama administration. How can we remain a friend of Israel while outreaching to the wider Arab and Muslim communities?
I think, first of all, I don't wish to oversimplify. It's a terribly complicated problem that has baffled immensely talented and dedicated statesmen for the whole life of the states, and particularly the state of Israel in that theater. So I don't want to seem glib, but it seems to me nothing really substantial as a breakthrough or a durable achievement can be attained until there is a general recognition in the Muslim world of Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. And they have, there has been de facto concession of that by the governments of Jordan and of Egypt and of some of the more distant countries like Morocco and up to a point the United Arab Emirates. But the Islamic forces in general do not accept that. And Palestine could have their state next week if they would accept that. And in my opinion, Israel should not be encouraged to, and in any case should not, negotiate with anyone who does not accept a priori, at the outset, the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish state. That was established unanimously by the Security Council when Israel was set up as a country with more legitimacy than any other country. It wasn't just admitted to the UN founded it as a country. And they should stick to that. But those who do accept that, there's plenty of room for discussion of the borders and other terms. But neither the illegitimacy of Israel should be given the slightest attention as a subject worthy of discussion, nor this concept that Israel should consent to be flooded with non-Jews who will then reduce Jews to a minority in the country that was founded as a homeland for the Jews. They can't do that.
Since its formation, the European Union has been a counterweight to the United States. Do you think the EU as a concept has failed, and how has this impacted American global power?
I don't think it's failed. I think it failed in its more extreme ambitions. I think it's a wonderful thing that these ancient nationalities with such a long history of terrible and almost incessant conflict between themselves are now living at peace, working quite well and cooperatively together economically. Of course, there are frictions, but there are frictions between Alabama and Mississippi, or between Boston and New York. I mean, the frictions between next door neighbors in any community. These things happen, but the countries are working well together. Where I think a problem arose was this theory that you could integrate Europe, make it one vast confederal entity, like one large country, and in some cases, to my certain knowledge, some of the advocates of that became prey to this romantic notion that after 100 years, starting with the beginning of the First World War, if the Europeans just stood on each other's shoulders, they would be back as the center of the world and the most influential part of the world. And that was nonsense. It was nonsense both in that they were not going to reach that level of cooperation, and even if they did, they still wouldn't be the center of the world. But I don't think it's a failure. I think that they they sort of lapped themselves. They started with modest and reasonable goals and then became more ambitious in what they thought they could achieve and can't achieve it. But they shouldn't become discouraged. They should hang on to what's useful there. It's a, it is a common market, and they live in peace. They have a high standard of living, but they over-socialized, and they paid, in domestic economic terms, too much Danegeld for notorious historic reasons to the working class and the small farmers. They're just too afraid of revolutions and uprisings. But they're not going to have things like that in Europe today.
Lord Black, as you're aware, the Obama administration is dealing with a trifecta of scandals: Benghazi, the IRS's targeting of conservative groups, and also the AP phone records. Let's chat for a second about the AP. Attorney General Eric Holder's Justice Department was caught snooping on the press, having obtained AP reporters' phone records without their knowledge. The Attorney General says he knew nothing about this and that the feds were hunting for a leak. Does hunting for a leak give the feds the right to intrude on the press?
I guess in some circumstances it does, but now here I must again confess I'm not an expert on exactly what the current state of the national security authorization for this kind of thing is. There certainly are circumstances in which you would have to say the Attorney General was justified, even if he admitted that he had ordered it, which he doesn't, of course, in this kind of oversight, if there was a legitimate national security emergency. I don't think they're even trying to make any such claim. I have no standing to say whether the Attorney General himself knew about it, but there is a certain point at which the buck stops here, and he's got to stop pretending he doesn't know anything about anything untoward or embarrassing that happened in his department, but is largely responsible for anything useful that happens. And I think there is no question that the relentless invasions of privacy, but frankly, the relentless violations of almost every aspect of the Bill of Rights is a matter that Americans should be concerned about. 99.5% of your criminal prosecutions end in convictions, and 97% of those are without a trial. And that's because the whole plea bargain system is so misused and abused by prosecutors that they can intimidate anybody. And I think Americans should be terribly concerned about it. You've got 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's incarcerated people, 50% of the world's lawyers. The lawyers take 10% of your GDP, and you have 6 to 12 times as many incarcerated people as the roughly comparable countries, prosperous, flourishing democracies. I refer to Australia, Canada, France, Britain, Germany, and Japan. Why aren't Americans more focused on this?
And what about the IRS targeting of conservative groups? President Obama says neither he nor anyone in the White House knew anything about this, but history shows presidents have used the IRS for political purposes, including Kennedy, Nixon, and Roosevelt. Roosevelt allegedly used the IRS to harass newspaper publishers who were opposed to the New Deal, such as William Randolph Hearst. Can you believe President Obama when he says he didn't know anything about this?
Yeah, it's not, as you know, I'm a biographer of Roosevelt. It's not just an allegation. He certainly did that. He subjected the owner of the Chicago Tribune, Colonel McCormick, to countless tax audits, and he did actually send the owner of the Philadelphia Inquirer to prison, in that he did locate apparently some incomplete tax returns or inaccurate ones. But there's not the slightest shadow of doubt that this practice goes on. But again, I have no standing to say whether anyone in the administration or in the Democratic Party's re-election campaign organization had any direct contact with the IRS. I wouldn't know that. But I would have thought that at the very least you would want to get to the bottom of who it was who ordered these activities and what kind of authority they thought they had to do it. But I certainly would give the Attorney General and the President the benefit of the doubt that they didn't order it themselves. But everybody should know, and I'm sure everybody, experienced journalists like yourself, do know, that the reach for plausible deniability in these matters has been a very long one for a long time. And you know, some of these practices, you'll want to reform them a bit. I mean, it's not the end of the world. It's not the latter days of the Roman Empire. But things like this just should not be happening.
You're the author of Richard Nixon, A Life in Full. In recent days, many comparisons have been drawn between Barack Obama and Richard Nixon, not only in aspects of their personality, but also in the scandals that have enveloped both presidencies. What parallels do you see between these two men?
Not very many, other than that they were both outsiders. It's hard to think of Nixon in this way because, of course, the pigmentation question, the color question, didn't come into play with him. But he was a man born into very modest circumstances, and he always felt himself an outsider. He was not someone to whom success came easily. He had to work terribly hard to be on the second team of the football team and that sort of thing. He wasn't a natural, gregarious star like a John F. Kennedy or Ronald Reagan or Nelson Rockefeller or something like that. But beyond that, it's stretching it a bit. Mr. Obama is a much more fluid and relaxed person. I've never met him, but so he seems to me. I knew Mr. Nixon, but not the current president. And he seems to be frankly less, I hate to use the word neurotic, but I think President Nixon sometimes was slightly neurotic. He certainly had his enemies, but he allowed the existence of enemies to color his judgment sometimes, and I don't see that Mr. Obama does that. I don't think this is, to be fair, a particularly scandalous administration. But Nixon was crucified. I mean, he had one of the most successful terms in American history. If you look at the condition the country was in when he came in '69, and at the end of his first term in '73, got everybody out of Vietnam while preserving a non-communist government, founded the Environmental Protection Agency, signed the greatest arms control agreement in history, de-escalated the Cold War, opened relations with China, reduced the crime rate, ended inflation, ended the assassinations, spared the country busing around for school integration, which would have been a disaster. It was a brilliant administration, and it was destroyed for no valid reason. In the case of this administration, I don't think it's very successful, but I don't think they've done anything that should cause the president to be under a moral cloud particularly. I just don't think it's, so far, a very successful administration. I hope they do better the next 3 years.
And you recently wrote that we should not engage in the impeachment process. Talk to us about that.
Well, I think that process, especially for a president, it's different. You know, it applies, as you know, to all federal officials. But I perfectly understand you might want to remove a judge for relatively minor things in certain circumstances. But when you're talking about the chief of state, head of government, commander-in-chief of the armed forces, in Franklin D. Roosevelt's phrase, the head of the American people, you don't want to, in my opinion, it is undesirable and indeed not constitutional to, or at least it's not accurately based in the Constitution, to threaten the holder of that great office with removal from that office for anything other than legitimate, well-founded suspicion of really severe offenses that render that person utterly inappropriate to hold it. You cannot possibly say that about Nixon. He was a very successful president. The only possible charge against him was that some of the money advanced to Watergate defendants, he knew nothing in advance about Watergate, that's not contested, was partly in consideration for altered testimony. But there's not proof of that. And it's not clear that in a fair trial you would have got proof of it, and it's not clear that it would have disqualified him from suitability to continue his term. There was no grounds whatsoever to justify the impeachment of Bill Clinton. What he did was tawdry, certainly. He came fairly close to perjury in a mousetrap issue on a very secondary question, but I don't think he crossed that line. He never should have been sent to the Senate for a trial. And Benghazi looks to me like a very shabby business, a tragic and a shabby business. But there's, as far as I know, obviously things could be there under the floorboards we don't see, and I'm not privy to anything. I'm just a foreigner watching these things. But there's nothing so far to indicate that you have any reason to impeach the president or to do the equivalent to the former Secretary of State, Mrs. Clinton, or the former Defense Secretary Leon Panetta. We just shouldn't be talking in those terms. With Watergate, we got into this business of the criminalization of policy differences, and as soon as they reached a certain point, everybody reached for the maximum weapon, which was, let's have a special prosecutor and let's drag everybody through this terrible ordeal. And it hasn't worked, you know. I mean, even that Iran-Contra business, it was nonsense. And Mr. Walsh indicted Caspar Weinberger, who was a distinguished public servant who didn't do anything. It was nonsense. And we just shouldn't be getting into this. I hope that in the year where my friend Scooter Libby, the then Chief of Staff to Vice President Cheney, was torn down on a false charge, and the five-term senator from Alaska, Ted Stevens, was denied re-election by a narrow margin because of a conviction on evidence that was proved to be false and fraudulent to the knowledge of the prosecutors, and was overturned after he'd lost his election, that the powers that be in Washington would do something to try and reform this situation, but they're not doing it. You have a prosecutorial class in that country that is out of control. And instead of being controlled by the Congress, which has the power to do it, I don't mean preventing prosecutors from doing their work. It's a terribly important job. We have to fight crime. But preventing them from terrorizing the country the way they are, they seem to have fallen in step with it and routinely threaten one side, the other, and then back and forth with impeachment all the time. It's at the drop of a hat, and it's extremely damaging to the whole nature and content of public discourse.
Lord Conrad Black, thank you so much for being with us today. Again, the book is called Flight of the Eagle: The Grand Strategies That Brought America from Colonial Independence to World Leadership. It's a terrific read. Lord Conrad Black, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Nice to be with you.
And thank you for watching Newsmax TV.